So if you were with me for the video that came right before this, we saw that if you had the quadratic x squared minus 9x plus 14, okay, that we were able to factor that into x minus 7 times x minus 2, right? Because negative 7 times negative 2 is positive 14, and negative 7 plus negative 2 is negative 9. Okay, so that's great. So what I want you to notice here is that these are two versions of the same form. Okay, two versions of the same form. In other words, one thing that I could say is that x squared minus 9x plus 14 is equal to x minus 7 times x minus 2. This is called standard form, and this one's called factored form. Okay, so let's say you were asked to take a quadratic trinomial, or really just a function, and solve it by factoring. So solve the quadratic by factoring. Okay, and it specifically says by factoring. Okay, so there are two ways that you might get this. You might get the factored form of it, right? So you might see something that says x minus 7 times x minus 2 equals 0. If you see that, then that's excellent, because a lot of the work has already been done for you, right? Because this is already in factored form. Okay, but this is the part that's important. If x minus 7 times x minus 2 equals 0, remember that anything times 0 equals 0, right? So 5 times 0 equals 0. 8 times 0 equals 0. 1.265 times 0 equals 0. Anything times 0 equals 0. And even more importantly, the only way that you can get 0 using multiplication is if one of the things that you're multiplying by is equal to 0. Okay? Very important. Why is that important? Because that's how this whole thing with solving by factoring works. Okay? If I know that this times this equals 0, then by necessity, either x minus 2 equals 0, okay, or x minus 7 equals 0. One of these factors has to equal 0. That is why, with a quadratic, when we are solving a quadratic, that is why we end up with two values most of the time. Because we end up having this situation that says, what happens when x minus 7 equals 0? Okay? Because remember, if x minus 7 equals 0, then 0 times x minus 2 is going to equal 0. Okay? And then our other thing that we have to solve is what happens when x minus 2 equals 0. Okay? And then that's just a one-step equation that you guys know. You add 7 to both sides in this case, and you get x equals 7. You add 2 to both sides in this case, and you get x equals 2. And that's why your answers are almost always whatever the opposite of this number is. Now, obviously, when you have a leading coefficient other than 1, that changes a little bit. But right now, we know our two answers are x equals 7 or x equals 2. And the way that I like to write that is I like to write it like this. X equals, I open my curly braces, which looks a little bit like a mustache sideways, and I put 2 comma 7, and they are curly braces rather than parentheses, so you don't think that that is the coordinates of something on a coordinate plane. Okay, so so if you see something that's in factored form, then this is how you go ahead and solve it. Now, of course, it may not be in factored form, right? It could easily be in quadratic form. So if it's in quadratic form, then let's say you had something like x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. Okay, so if they tell you to solve by factoring, okay, if they tell you to solve by factoring, well, obviously your first step is to factor. No leading coefficient over here, which means that the leading coefficient is 1. So we'll go ahead and we'll open our two parentheses. We'll keep it equal to 0. And if you were with me on the last episode, you know that since this is plus and this is minus, that means that both of these need to be minus, right? Whenever the second one is plus, these need to match. So you just need to look at the first one to see which one they're going to be. These are going to both be x's because my leading coefficient is 1. And so I just need to figure out what two numbers multiply to give me 6 and add to give me negative 5. What's that? Ding, 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 you're right. It's negative 2 and negative 3 because negative 2 plus negative 3 is negative 5 and negative 2 times negative 3 is positive 6. So I've got x minus 2 times x minus 3. X minus 2 times x minus 3 equals 0. And then we can just finish this puppy off. X minus 2 equals 0. Why would that equal 0? Because if this equals 0, then 0 times this equals 0, right? Or x minus 3 equals 0 for the same reason. If this is 0, then 0 times this will equal 0. Okay? Hope everybody's getting that. And then let me change my color real quick. Add 2 to both sides. And x equals 2. Yay! Add 3 to both sides. And x equals 3. Yay! Okay, great. And then to use our fancy notation, x equals curly brace 2 comma 3, which means that it could equal either 2 or 3.